Hi, welcome everyone to this discussion with Dr. Aparna Pande. Dr. Aparna Pande is the director of the Initiative on the Future of India and South Asia at the Hudson Institute, Washington, D.C. A major field of interest is South Asia, with a special focus on India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, foreign and security policy. Dr. Pande is also an author, and she has authored books like Making India Great, The Promise of a Reluctant Global Power, From Chanakya to Modi, The Evolution of India's Foreign Policy, Explaining Pakistan's Foreign Policy, Escaping India. And she's also edited quite a few books. A few of them are Contemporary Handbook on Pakistan and the Contemporary Handbook on South Asian Foreign Policy. Dr. Pande, thank you for taking out time and being with us today to discuss this continuously evolving situation that is the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and helping our viewers. Yeah, and helping our viewers understand what's the way forward for India's relationship with Russia. So I welcome you. So we'll just get right to the questions.
Please do. Thank you.
So in the aftermath of the 1 year sort of conflict that's been going on between Russia and Ukraine, what looks like the way forward for the region? I mean, for Eastern Europe as a whole, if you could just take us through that.
Sure. Unfortunately, I believe that we will have to live through what we have lived through for the last year, the region especially. The rest of the world may may have less problems because the fuel crisis and the food and fertilizer crisis are not as bad as they were last year. But the region, I believe, will have to live through it. It appears to be, a different form of not exactly World War II trench warfare, but it is both sides are entrenched wherever they are. The Russian side has not been able to do what Vladimir Putin wanted, which is blitzkrieg, going in, taking over, getting it all done in a few weeks. It didn't happen. And since that didn't happen, both sides are stuck where they are. Now, the Ukrainians have launched or are launching a counter-offensive. Let us see how far they go in that and what their aim is. Simply to push back the Russians from certain strategic places and then convince some negotiation which leads to Russia returning some parts, or if it ends up being 2 steps forward, 1 step back, then 2 steps forward, 1 step back. The Russian side, yes, they have challenges, but they have a very big military. And they are also, we must not forget that they are used to suffering losses, the Battle of Stalingrad, the scorched earth policy. So they are used to, and they have been through a lot worse during the last, let's say, the world wars. So there's a lot more that the Russians can take, and maybe even the Ukrainians. Finally, the Ukrainians have received a lot of military equipment, training, and other support from many countries around the world, not just Western Europe and the US and Canada, but also Japan, Australia, and many of the, I would say, American and European allies and partners. So they do have a lot of support, economic and military. So, but unfortunately, I don't see, and I don't think anybody sees a quick victory for either side.
Okay, no, thank you. That was really insightful, and it clears things up a lot. But like you mentioned that Putin hasn't been able to sort of do what he wanted to, just sort of get the job done, and get out of Ukraine. So that wasn't possible. So has that somehow made Russia now more weaker and more vulnerable? And the recent Wagner incident, which lasted all of but 1 day, but is that a sign of a larger domestic instability for Russia?
So anybody who has been in power for so long, especially a dictator or an autocrat, will always have challenges and issues. And just as Putin rose up the ladder, there will be others who want to do so. One of the challenges which Putin has faced and which has created, we must remember there is not just one Wagner. There are multiple mercenary groups. Because at the end of the day, you and I have both seen that the average Russian is not necessarily interested in going and fighting a war. There have been protesters, there have been protests, and they have been imprisoned. There are opposition figures like Navalny, who is still in prison, and many others around the world who Russians do not want. Many Russians have fled the country. and are refugees because they don't want to fight. So they've had to go for the criminal elements, the mercenary groups. And anytime you use a mercenary group, then, or you use multiple mercenary groups, anytime the state cedes coercive power of the state to a non-state entity, you always create problems for the state's way to hold power, right? The state is the only entity in any country which should have the power to use force and equipment, not other entities. So there are multiple such entities which Putin has created. I'm sure that you've seen the last few days, there have been a few generals who have been removed, and there are rumors about other generals being removed because Wagner, Prigozhin must have had supporters, and maybe they were hoping that he will, that his coup will follow through and they will be able to take over, but it hasn't happened. Putin may be weak, but Putin does have power still. We must remember he has his own paramilitary force which protects him, which is quite big. So for Prigozhin or anyone else to actually undertake that coup would have required much more support within the broader Russian military. Maybe somebody does have that support. We'll have to wait and see. We could just be one coup away from a successful coup. At the end of the day, if there's a coup, it has to be successful. If it's not successful, nothing happens. But yes, the Russian state is weak. After 1 year of war, where you have not managed to successfully gain additional territory, which and then move on, it creates a problem. Russia is weaker militarily, economically, and as long as the global system still rests on the dollar and let's say the US or the Western world-based financial system, SWIFT and all of that, there will be problems that Russia will face, because you can't purchase anything in dollars. All accounts have been frozen. And so you are dependent on either that country's currency, like yuan or rupee or something like that, which doesn't really get you what you really need.
No, that makes sense, Dr. Pandey. And like you mentioned, that after 1 year of fighting and not being able to make significant inroads into Ukraine, and also the Western sanctions and all of the SWIFT ban and all of those things have put Russia in a very tough spot and put them up against the wall. So how does China factor in, with all of this? Because does this, instability and vulnerability mean a more dominant China, influencing Russian decisions? And if so, then how does that impact India?
I would say yes to both, and it creates a lot of problems for India. But first, let me start with the Russia-China. Russia, over the last few years, there has been a growing relation, increasing integration between Russia and China. Now, we must remember the Soviet Union and China historically had problems. The Soviet Union was the dominant country. Soviet Union and China had problems, but they were together till the split, which took place in 66, 67. After the two of them had it's not just ideological for the Soviet Union, there were also boundary issues and border disputes, which are still there between China and Russia. Some of those are ignored by Russia in more recent years because they are trying to have a better relationship with China. But we must not forget that in places like in the remote parts, so Russia is a huge country with not a very large population. And it is one of those countries which is going through what is called a decline in population. You don't have enough, children being born. And so there's a negative growth rate. Putin has tried for the last decade or so to offer cash incentives if people have 1, 2, or 3 babies or more, but that's not happening. And so what is happening in parts of Russia is that you have land, but you don't have people. And in many of those areas, Chinese workers, Chinese migrants have gone in. And so Russia has a bigger, broader problem with China. However, strategically, the two countries are coming closer together because it is a question of my enemy is your enemy, and so let's come closer. So the Russian problem with Western Europe and the United States, with Japan. Remember, Russia, Japan also have a dispute, and sort of the rise of China and Chinese desire for dominance, which clashes with the American strategic desire to ensure that there is no country which dominates, or which dominates or pushes back at the American hegemony which is there, or the American dominance which is there, or the American-led rules-based international order. Russia and China's views of the world clash with this liberal rules-based order, the free and open Indo-Pacific in the maritime domain, and also on the continent. And so Russia and China have come closer together. Sanctions against Russian, oligarchs, sanctions against Russian defense companies, sanctions against Russian companies over the years by the Western world has led Russia closer to China, more dependent on China. Over the last year, that dependence has increased, primarily because if Russia does not have access to the dollar or to the global currency, it is more dependent on China for spare parts, for any access to the global world that it cannot get access to on its own. There are also reports that China has provided some form of military support to Russia. And so sort of all of these show that there are closer ties. Now, at some level, now how does it affect India? We have to remember that for India, Russia has been important because when Delhi looks at the continental landmass of Asia, it sees China, which has always been a threat and a rival and sits on Indian territory for decades and refuses to accept the boundary line. And India's fought a war which India lost in 1962. Right next to China is Russia, or former Soviet Union. And for decades, so especially since 1966, Soviet Union and later Russia used to balance China. You're looking at there, so you need one country to balance the other. And so Russia balanced China. The Soviet Union helped India on the UN Security Council vis-a-vis Kashmir and many other issues. It also vetoed anything which India did not want. So India had a supporter on the UN Security Council. Russia did that, but in the last decade or so, Russia is less reliable for India. Very often it supports China, when it's because China supports Pakistan. And so what has happened over the last decade or two, as India's ties with the United States have improved, and as India's relations with China have worsened, and Russia's relations with China have improved, Russia has started to side more with China, less with India, even on global fora. Second, India has always wanted Russia to counter China. India has also wanted Russia, or formerly Soviet Union, to to be the balancer, provide India with the, military equipment. Around 70% of Indian military equipment is Russian made, and around 40% of the imports come from Russia. However, if Russia gets closer to China, so close that it is dependent on China, then India's strategic autonomy faces an issue. Because if at some future conflict, border conflict with China, Russia refuses to provide the spare parts or cannot provide the spare parts because of the war that is going on in Ukraine, where it is using everything for that war, right? Rather than supplying it to other countries, then where does India stand? So India's challenge is it does not want Russia getting closer to China. Unfortunately, the way global politics is going, Russia is getting closer to China. Now, will Kremlin or Moscow be able to maintain sufficient distance from Beijing that they have autonomy in certain relationships. It will all depend on whether Russia is able to maintain a certain amount of strength or if it gets weaker. And so India's dilemma will be, can it keep Russia away from sort of total embrace of China, or is that too late? Is it too late to prevent something which is happening? And so sort of Delhi has that dilemma. So India still purchases and has been purchasing Russian oil. India has not openly condemned Russian invasion, even though it has talked about the fact that this is not a century of war. There should be peaceful negotiations. India has a relationship with Ukraine as well. And so India is trying to be a mediator of sorts, and is also trying not to push relations with Russia too far. But sort of, sometimes global politics will sort of, mean that countries need to maybe adjust or adapt their policies, even if for a few years, because we don't know where the Russia-Ukraine war is going to go.
No, that makes sense, Dr. Pandey. I mean, that really, sort of sums it up pretty well. And, there was another question that I wanted to ask you at the very end, but I'll just, since you've brought it up, the energy imports and, all those things, purchasing Russian oil. So I'll just club it with this question, and probably this will be the last question that we do. So, I mean, with this backdrop, with Russia cozying up with China and, sort of, China maybe, at some point, calling the shots over there. And like you also said that, if the resources are drained, and then you first, help yourself before you start,
Yes.
before you can help others. So then where does that leave India? So was, PM Modi's visit to the US, I mean, is that going, India getting closer to US? Is that a strategic move so that, it doesn't have all its eggs in one basket? And what does that mean for Indo-Russia relations, going forward?
So yes, I believe the Prime Minister's visit to United States, and I think in July he's going to France around Bastille Day, if I'm not mistaken. There's going to be a dialogue between him and President Macron. And so sort of, India's sort of, while Soviet Union or Russia was historically one of India's leading defense suppliers, the other three in the last 2 decades have been Israel, France, and United States. So I do believe that, that the Indian government understands the challenges, but you and I both know that, replacing military equipment takes decades. It cannot happen, this is not the same as replacing a laptop or an iPhone. You can't just walk into a shop, transfer everything, and walk out. So yes, the visit to the United States, and especially the defense agreements which were signed, where an American private company, General Electric, will collaborate with HAL to produce a jet engine. What that means, so this is one of those big items. If a jet engine is produced now, you can work together in sort of, in a lot more things moving forward. Or India's purchase of those Predator drones, around 30 or 31 of those drones, which can help India on, on both the maritime and continental front, along the border with China, but everywhere else as well. So these are India's ways of, sort of ensuring that there are other suppliers and other countries, which even if India right now is still dependent on those spare parts which come from Russia, at least it is planning for the next decade or two where its dependence on any one country, which goes against strategic autonomy. Sort of any one country is reduced, and then there are multiple countries which are offering and working with India, and that a lot of it also is indigenously manufactured. So that India's long-held desire of sort of manufacturing indigenously and therefore not being dependent on another country or set of countries can also be fulfilled. You were asking about the Russian oil. Now, sort of, historically, India's purchase of Russian oil was about 1% of India's oil purchase. You must remember most of India's oil comes from the Middle East, North Africa, region, all of those countries. And so again, oil, different kinds of crude oil need different kinds of refineries. So what the price cap helped was that India could purchase a lot more of oil, but then Indian refineries are also selling that oil because India cannot use that oil because Indian refineries and all need the they are more attuned to the Gulf oil. And so what they are doing is some of it is being, used by India. The rest of it is actually being sold to other countries in Europe and all, which can actually get it at a lower price. And therefore, in some ways, it's helping them avoid very high, very high costs of oil. But still, this is a temporary thing. There is no way that, that oil prices will remain so low. Oil prices will go up sooner or later. So the percentage of Indian purchase of Russian oil is a temporary thing. India can't really use most of it. And so the oil which India uses will be dependent on what the prices of the Gulf countries or OPEC will be, which will go up sooner or later.
Yeah, I mean, OPEC recently, they've also cut production, supply of it. So,
yeah.
That'll always, come up to a point. So, yeah, that makes sense. And thank you so much, Dr. Pande, for, taking time out and helping us viewers understand, the global evolving geopolitics. And we enjoyed, thoroughly, speaking to you. And we look forward to doing this again very soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Prassenjit.